Hello to everyone and welcome to the lecture Demographic Development in China, a road from one-child policy to three-child policy, within the ReConnect MOOC course Introduction to Chinese Politics and Society. My name is Steve Tammaro and I'm the Professor of Population and Urban Geography at the University of Tartu. The themes of my lecture are as follows. I will start with a historic overview about the formation, implementation, as well as the abandonment of the one-child policy in China. This will lead me to the introduction of the three-child policy, and I will ask, would it help to avoid population loss in China in the 21st century? I will answer to this question in the third part of the lecture, where I have constructed three different population development scenarios for the 21st century. First, I will show what happens with Chinese population if current fertility levels will persist throughout the century. Then I will ask, what is the level of fertility needed to maintain its current population size? And finally, I will ask, how many migrants would China need in order to maintain its current population? So let us start from one-child policy that was enforced in China from around 1979 till 2015. It is important to understand the context where the one-child policy formed in China. First of all, the world population growth started to accelerate. It reached from 1 billion to 2 billion with 127 years, but from 2 billion to 3 billion in 1960 with only 33 years. And this raised growing concerns on overpopulation and global movements of birth control. And also the first population conference sponsored by the United Nations was held in 1954. It is also important to understand the Chinese context where both more global, long-term as well as short-term factors combined with each other. First of all, the Great Leap Forward famine in 1959 to 1961 had dramatic effects on the population and economic development of China. The estimated number of excess deaths ranged from 20 to 45 million, and GDP per capita decreased by about 25%. So these were the short-term effects that made the Chinese government to think of how to feed the population. However, there was also a more fundamental and long-term decrease in death rates taking place, and when looking at other countries around the world, it always happens so that death rates start to decrease, and after that, with a time lag only, fertility rates decrease. And this period where death rates are low, but birth rates are high, population starts to explode. China is no exception in this regard. Of course, during the famine, death rates went up and birth rates went down. But overall, what we see from this graph is that death rates have been low and life expectancy started to grow in China. And with a time lag, it has been following by the decrease of fertility. And this pattern overall is very similar and repeats from country to country. However, the Chinese government tried to accelerate the decrease of the birth rate. And it started before the official start of the one-child policy with more softer family planning measures. And in the beginning of the 1970s, a family planning slogan, later, longer, fewer, was introduced by the Chinese government. And the aim of that slogan was to convince couples first that they give birth to the first child at an older age, to have longer time intervals between birth, that would ultimately then lead to having fewer children. In 1978, family planning principles were written into the Constitution, and in 1979, penalties were introduced for having more than one children in urban families, and in 1980, the birth quota system was introduced. So let us look at the main features of the birth quota system. So the State Family Planning Commission set a target to the total number of children that were allowed to give birth in a given year. And then this total number was allocated downward the administrative hierarchy, so that exact number of children allowed to be born in each area was set. As a next step, local officials were the ones who selected those families and couples who were included to the birth quota in the given year, and these selected families then received a permit to get a child. So it was a very bureaucratic system that operated down to the local. There were also several penalties for those couples who violated the rule and gave birth without having a birth permit. First, these were direct financial penalties, and they could easily equal to the annual income of the household. Second, China introduced additional taxes that were called social support or social maintenance fees. And the reason behind this was that each child needs education, needs health care, and those families who have more than one child have to contribute to these social systems. But what was maybe the most efficient way was related to the loss of urban resident status within the whole system, because the urban resident status gave many benefits for the family, ranging from pensions and other benefits, and therefore the one-child policy was much more efficient in urban context and in cities compared to rural areas. Let us add some flesh to the bones by looking how the one-child policy operated on the example of Hebei province in the 1980s, based on a paper published in a Population and Development Review. First of all, what we do see that among the studied households, about 15,000, only about half of the births were given with birth permit. There are important differences between the first and second child. When it comes to the first child, almost 9 out of 10 were born with birth permit. When it comes to the second child, only 1 out of 10 was born with a birth permit. The second important difference runs between urban and rural households. 9 children out of 10 in urban households were born with a birth permit, while less than half were born with permit in the rural households. This would lead us to the conclusion that the one-child policy was effective because it was mainly targeted towards urban families. However, quite interestingly, if we look at the population change in China during the period of one-child policy from 1979 to 2015, what we do see is almost a linear population growth throughout the study period. And it calls the question, was the policy really effective? And what comes to play here is the specific nature of demographic processes. And very often, when we talk about policy, we talk about concrete behavior of the households when it comes to fertility, mortality, migration. But in addition to the behavior, it's also important what is the underlying age structure that shapes population progress. In other words, there is always a very long inertia effect in population change. Demographic behavior, for example, the number of children each household wants to have, is only one element that predicts future population, but the other is population structure or the number of people who are in the family ages. So these factors together predict what would be the size of the future population. So this is true that demographic behavior changed in China, especially among the urban households. Fertility dropped, but during the one-child policy period, people who were born before the policy changed entered the family ages, and that was the factor that supported this population growth throughout the one-child policy period. However, what we do see is that there is a trend change taking place right now in China. The population growth has stabilized. The number of people entering the family ages are also in decline, and that means that the future population of China is dramatically decreasing, both because of the current low fertility rates and because of the fact that the small generations born in the one-child policy period are in the family ages right now. So, if current fertility levels persist, Chinese population will decrease dramatically, almost halving by the end of the century. But what's more, its age structure is changing dramatically too. When at the moment still there are lots of people who are in the family ages in China, then already in the middle of this century, we see quite important aging taking place. The number of children is decreasing further, and the population of China is getting older. And when we look at the end of the 21st century, we see that the aging of the population has increased further. The number of children is contracting even further, and the number of people in the retirement age is increasing quite rapidly. In this context, it's not surprising that China has abandoned its one-child policy. Rather, it's surprising why did Chinese government stick for so long time to this policy. However, in 2015, officially, we can say that the one-child policy ended and two-child policy was introduced, and since 2021, China is talking about a three-child policy. It means that couples are allowed to give birth up to 3 children, and China also abolished the social maintenance fee for families having more than one child. As we have already seen, the Chinese population will almost halve by the end of this century if current fertility levels persist. And here in this projection, I have assumed that the fertility level is 1.2 children on average per one woman. And so the important question then would be that would the three-child policy help to make change in this trend line, or could migration help to reduce the population decline of China? And if so, how many people China would need to migrate into the country to keep its population stable? As a next step, I will therefore show you the population projections that focus either on fertility or migration in keeping China's population on its current level. So let us start with fertility. And what is the average number of births needed each year to keep Chinese population at 1.4 million stable till the end of this century? What we see is that three-child policy would indeed help. What we also do see is that there is no urgent need that fertility rates would rapidly increase to this level, but rather there is a need for a gradual increase till the year 2060. And what's also interesting, since then there is no need to keep this high level of fertility to keep population stable, and fertility rate could drop again to its current level, and Chinese population still will remain stable. And the reason is that after 2060, these bigger generations enter family ages, and their bigger number help to support Chinese population size, and fertility within the couples could start to decline again. The second scenario relates to migration, and here what I do is that I keep fertility stable on its current level, and I ask how many migrants does China need each and every year to keep its population stable at the level of 1.4 billion. What appears is that there is a need for a gradual growth of migrants from year to year, from about 3 million a year to more than 10 million a year around 2060. And since then, the need for additional migrants each year would somewhat decrease. We already know that without migration and at current fertility levels, Chinese population would halve. It doesn't mean that all this loss of people should be compensated by migrants alone, because migrants also have children. So all in all, during this period, about 400 million migrants are needed to keep the Chinese population stable. Still, it's a huge number. Just to put it into perspective, there are altogether about 300 million migrants globally, which means that all the migrants should lead to China, and it will still not keep the population of China stable. Or if each and every person from the United States of America would leave to China, it's also not enough to keep its population number stable. So overall, the measures that would help to keep population stable in China would then relate to fertility and migration, but still it's not very likely that the current population size in China could be maintained in the future. What's also interesting, all the three scenarios when the current fertility persists and there is no migration, but fertility rises to levels to keep population stable, and when fertility remains stable but migration helps to keep population stable, lead to very different age structures of China. In the first scenario, if current fertility persists and there is no migration, we see a very rapid aging and the number of children is decreasing very rapidly. And the age structures also vary in case of the fertility and migration scenarios. In case of migration scenario, we also see that the number of children is relatively smaller and the population is still aging very rapidly, while only the fertility scenario then helps to keep down the rapid aging of Chinese population. We can draw three important conclusions from what we learned so far. First, Chinese population did grow rapidly and in a linear fashion throughout the one-child policy period, and this growth was supported by the entering of large generations who were born before the policy was enforced to the family ages. However, now the smaller generations who were already born during the policy enforcement are entering the family ages, which means that a trend change is taking place in Chinese population development. And if the current fertility levels are maintained, China will witness a very dramatic population loss, and its population will almost halve by the end of 21st century. In theory, however, China could keep its population on its current level, and so our second conclusion is that three-child policy would help to achieve this aim. Furthermore, there is no immediate need to achieve this aim, but rather the fertility levels should grow gradually till the year 2060 to 3 children on average in a household, and that would help the population of China to stay its current level of 1.4 million. Alternatively, fertility would not change. China would need 400 million migrants, and that would also help to keep its population size on its current level. So, in theory, both high fertility or high migration, or the combination of the two, could help China to maintain its population size. But in real life, we will almost be sure that the population of China will continue to decrease, and the main question would be how big that decrease would be. Thank you very much for listening.